summer reading. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started again. Our next presentation is going to focus on mitigation, and it's going to be presented by Andrea Galvin. So our bio for Andrea says, as the founder and principal architectural historian of GPA Consulting, Andrea Galvin has been professionally involved in research and documentation of historic districts, sites, buildings, and structures for more than a decade. Yes, this bio might be a little old. A little over 2 decades. With extensive training in historic preservation and a Master's of Science degree in historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania, Andrea's professional journey has included assignments throughout California, the United States, and Europe. Prior to founding GPA, Andrea worked for the California Department of Transportation as an associate architectural historian, the California Department of Parks and Recreation, and the California Office of Historic Preservation. With comprehensive experience in all aspects of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, CEQA, and historic surveys, Andrea has researched and coordinated a wide variety of projects working with various federal, state, and local agencies. She also assists cities with surveys, ordinances, and design guidelines, and has prepared several training seminars on preparing and conducting surveys. In addition to her master's degree, Andrea received her Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Design from the University of California, Davis, and a Preservation Planning certificate from Istanbul Technical University, Turkey. She meets Secretary of Interior's professional qualification standards for architectural history and is going to give us a presentation on mitigation.
Thank you, Susan. This is actually a presentation that I pulled together with some other colleagues from the California Preservation Foundation for the American Planning Association, and received really great feedback on it. What we're going to cover today, this is sort of an agenda of what we're going to be covering today. Of course, we can't talk about mitigation without going through the regulatory framework, so we will go through some of the regulations. In order to identify mitigation, you have to really know what the facts are regarding not only the resource, but the project and how the project might impact the resource. Sometimes you can plan for mitigation in advance. Mitigation shouldn't be something that you're thinking about on a case-by-case basis at the very end of your planning process. Like any good planning, you should be always thinking ahead at the policy and governmental level about how to handle certain situations regarding mitigation. Mitigation's always been a pet peeve of mine because as a consulting practitioner, sometimes we have to prepare mitigation, and it's always frustrating when you're given a set of requirements, either at the local or state level, that aren't well written or well defined. An example being that I was just talking with one of my colleagues during the break is that they're conducting mitigation for a jurisdiction that would like a video, but they don't know how long it should be or what it should look like. So it's really difficult to understand and know what that measure actually is that needs to be fulfilled if it's not well defined. So I'll talk about how to write legally defensible mitigation measures. And then finally, I'm going to give you a lot of fun examples, all real examples, just to get your creative juices flowing. I've also given all of you handouts that will step through kind of a laundry list, quite frankly, of all different mitigation measure options for avoidance, minimization, and so forth. And I've defined whether or not, in most cases, if you implement those measures, if it could minimize impacts to a level of less than significant or not. Those of you that are watching in online will post that. I'll ask John to post that after, so you'll have access to that as well. So getting started with what the regulations actually say. Mitigation obviously applies to both CEQA, NEPA, and Section 106. Most of what I'm focusing on today will be CEQA, but in a few instances I might mention Section 106. Susan did a great job of delineating the differences between the two, but this is primarily focused on CEQA. So under CEQA, the guidelines state the lead agency shall identify potentially feasible measures to mitigate significant adverse changes in the significance of a historical resource. And that's a shall. So that's not a, if you feel like it, if you have money left over in the budget when you're done, it's that you shall mitigate when there's a significant impact. It also needs to be adopted measures, and they should be fully enforceable, either through licenses, permits, conditions of approval. There should be something that triggers the authority of a lead agency to implement those measures. So just because a council member or a staff member says, hey, I really think that we might want to do this and that, if it isn't clearly defined in the process, then there's really no enforceability for somebody to do that. So let's get down to the root of mitigation, because I've heard all kinds of different definitions of what mitigation actually is. Does it have to completely remediate any loss, or does it just have to lessen? When you're applying mitigation measures, certain measures might fully remediate, some might just lessen, and some might be compensatory after the fact. And I'll get into that more later. But by definition, mitigate is a verb, and it means to lessen in force or intensity, to make less severe, and also it can make something milder or lessen in severity. So the definition there isn't to completely remove a pain or ailment. It's essentially to lessen it. So keep that in mind when we're talking about different mitigation options. Usually under CEQA, if there's a project where there is a discretionary authority and the lead agency has to make decisions, then they will do that through an environmental impact report, or EIR. That's been very clearly laid out earlier today. And the responsibility in the EIR is to describe feasible measures which could minimize adverse effects. And the term feasible is important because although we can always come up with pie in the sky ideas, and those of us that are interested in preserving historic resources might have better ideas of what we might want done to that building or project or site. Anything can be done with lots of money, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all options are feasible. It should also look at each potential significant environmental effect. And there are many projects where there might be multiple alternatives that a lead agency is considering. An example of that might be high-speed rail, where there's, it's a long linear resource, and it's going through multiple jurisdictions, and depending on what alternative they decide to adopt, they need to see what those impacts are. And it's possible that a project might have multiple alternatives when it's going through the CEQA process, because that's a document that's used by the decision makers to make the decision of what their preferred alternative will be. So part of that decision-making process should be, what are those effects going to be under each alternative, so that they can hopefully select the environmentally superior alternative. Or they also need to know what potential mitigation measures are as well, because that might factor into the overall cost or schedule of the project. So again, mitigation is something you need to think about early and often through the planning process, and not always necessarily at the end, because the cost or types of mitigation required for various alternatives could also affect the decision of which alternative selected. As I mentioned, the measures have to be fully enforceable through licenses, permits, other legally binding documents. When a lead agency is planning a document, they'll often prepare studies that identify what resources are, what the impacts are going to be, and measures. But keep in mind, if those are done by the lead agency themselves, or they contract it out to a qualified professional, that those are professional opinions of potential mitigation measures that could lessen. The report itself is not a legally binding document. The report that's prepared itself is a professional opinion, or it might even give alternatives for different potentialities. An example might be, if alternative A is selected, then these measures might mitigate to a level of less than significant. These measures might fully avoid impacts. You get the idea. So that's not to say that the lead agency has to adopt all of those recommendations that are in that study. The appropriate way to do that might be through conditions of approval or a separate agreement document that, after vetting all of the potential options, it's definitively stated that the lead agency shall impose these mitigation measures. That becomes the document. It's usually, signed. This is an instance where Section 106 is a little more clearly defined in this area, because 800.6 of Section 106 involves resolving adverse effects, and the means for doing that is called a finding of effect document. And I'm sorry, that was 800.5, and 800.6 is resolving those adverse effects, and that is through a memorandum of agreement, and that's an agreement document that is actually signed by all parties involved, including the State Historic Preservation Officer, and in some instances, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation in Washington, D.C. Mitigation measures are not required for impacts that are found not to be significant. This is an important point, because you may find that there might be certain impacts, and maybe they're impacts that are temporary impacts or indirect impacts like noise or vibration. But if those, just because there's going to be construction and there might be some temporary noise, unless it meets a threshold that is defined as significant, there's not necessarily a requirement to mitigate against that. So sometimes I read documents and I see people making recommendations of what people could do or should do, simply because they think it might be a good idea. But keep in mind that if you can lessen those impacts or redesign your project in a manner that no longer meets that threshold for significant, no mitigation is required at all. So there should be an essential nexus between the mitigation measure and a legitimate environmental concern. And this came out of case law, essentially stating that lead agencies can't just make people do mitigation just because they want to. There has to be a legitimate connection of the lead agency to the project, and that an instance of that would be a lead agency that has jurisdiction or discretionary authority over something. So unless they have discretionary authority, a lead agency, a city or local government, should not be telling a local developer how they should be doing their project unless there's some discretionary action to allow them to do so. Not all cities have discretionary actions in place that protect historic properties. An example of that might be cities that allow demolition of properties with just paying a fee over the counter. It's a ministerial action. Even if it's a historic property, there's no nexus or legal connection or ability for a lead agency to do anything in that instance, unfortunately, under CEQA. Also, the measures must be roughly proportional to the impacts of the project. So let's say somebody is changing out their windows on a historic property that's been determined eligible for either the California Register or National Register of Historic Places. It would probably be inappropriate to require an individual property owner to prepare an entire historic structures report and do historic American building survey documentation and writing a historic context on wood windows and preparing a video on the building. You get the idea. The total cost of the project to replace the windows is, $30,000. You wouldn't want mitigation to cost $200,000. So keep that in mind too, that, sometimes if it's, you want to have the mitigation be roughly proportional to the significance of the property. Is it a property of national significance? Is it something that really is going to affect a lot of people? In which case, you probably are going to require more mitigation to give back. But if it's a small single-family dwelling within a historic district, you might lessen the mitigation required based on the nature of the undertaking and the significance of the resource. So let's start with the facts. You can't really talk about mitigation until you know what the property is. And unfortunately, sometimes people I've noticed in planning skip to the end and they talk about they already decide we're going to tear this building down. So let's just start talking about what we're going to do. And they don't really look at the other steps in CEQA, which are to look for opportunities to avoid or minimize or lessen those impacts. So you need to know what the property is, and you need to know what the boundaries are, what the period of significance is, if it's contributing to a district, whether it's contributing or not. And there's a whole other seminar that CPF provides on identifying and evaluating historic properties. So I'm not going to get into detail about that. But you have to know at what level it is. You know, like I mentioned, if it's national significance, who decides what that historic significance is? Is it eligible for the National Register, the California Register, or is it just technically a historic property because it was picked up in a survey in 1983, but a whole bunch of alterations have occurred since then? All of those things come into play too when you're thinking about mitigation. So then you want to define what the project is. What is the project? Is the project widening a sidewalk in front of a historic property, or is the project going to make an addition onto a historic property, or is the project going to completely remove a historic property? The mitigation measures for each of those scenarios would be very different. So we look at CEQA, and CEQA requires that we look at significant impacts that result from that project. So this isn't an opportunity for us to make a bunch of suggestions and recommendations for what we'd like to see in that area. An example might be if you have, let's say you have a historic district, and within that historic district you have a bicycle project. Maybe they're going to put in some new striping to accommodate bicycles. Maybe they'll have a few signs. Maybe they're going to put in a couple roundabouts within the existing streets and so forth. But 5 or 10 years ago, somebody came in and removed the historic sidewalks and put in new ADA sidewalks and ramps and so forth. Your responsibility is only to look at the impacts of the proposed project, which would be to add the roundabouts and the signage and the striping. It would be inappropriate to come up with mitigation measures or recommendations for them to reverse things that had been done that might have impacted the historic district in the past that were not part of this particular project. So it would be inappropriate to use Project B as an opportunity to fix alterations within a historic setting or district that resulted from Project A. And the impacts analysis under CEQA really does require that you look at different alternatives. There are different requirements under NEPA and CEQA in terms of how many alternatives that should be, and which alternative should be selected. At the end of the day, CEQA is under the discretion of the decision-making body. So even if there are better alternatives for a particular resource, it doesn't behoove the lead agency from selecting that one under CEQA, unfortunately. Susan talked about Section 4F of the National Transportation Act, and that is holds a little more teeth than CEQA does. So just because there are alternatives under CEQA that might be a rehabilitation alternative or an alternative that might lessen impacts on a resource, it doesn't mean determinately that that's the alternative that a lead agency may select. It is our requirement, though, to disclose what those impacts are going to be on each of the alternatives, and it's up to them to make that decision. If a member of the public disagrees with that decision because they don't like the project, they can get involved at the public level, but unfortunately that is the way that CEQA is laid out, is that it's the decision makers who get to make the decisions at the end of the day. So back to the regulatory framework, and Susan mentioned this as well, is that mitigation shall not be deferred until a future time. And this is something that we see where people spend a lot of time researching and evaluating and identifying the resource, and then they might spend a little time looking at the impacts and disclosing that, and sometimes the project changes and so forth. But if you're going to have an impact, you cannot simply state, well, after the preferred alternative is decided, then we're going to do our mitigation on that alternative only. Because like I said in the beginning, the types of mitigation measures have associated costs, and that could play into the decision-making process. Also, after the fact, there might not be funding set aside if the mitigation measures have not been determined at the time that the project's being adopted, or there might not be any enforceability. So that mitigation might accidentally slip under the rug and oh, well, nobody checked because that we were supposed to actually do mitigation, and therefore we lose a resource, or we have a significant impact on a resource with no remuneration whatsoever or accountability. And the mitigation measures should have specific performance standards, and I'm going to talk about that when I talk about defensible mitigation measures. It's important that when you're doing your impacts analysis that you identify what's actually part of the proposed project versus what is being imposed as mitigation. And sometimes this area gets gray, because a lead agency may start with a project, and as a result of discussion and decision making throughout the process, they may decide, oh, there are alternatives that are maybe better for the resource, so they may change their project during the process, and that's okay. Really what it comes down to is how you define your purpose and need at the outset of a project. But if, for example, your project is a rehabilitation project and you're already intending to apply the Secretary of Interior standards, which are a set of guidelines that help guide appropriate alterations to historic properties, that's part of the project, and therefore that's not mitigation. And the fact that you're doing it in accordance with the standards might not be considered an impact at all, a significant impact. However, if you're rehabilitating a project and you are not doing it in a manner that is responsible or compatible with the Secretary of Interior standards, and to lessen impacts on that building, you might require that they apply the Secretary of Interior standards to lessen those impacts to a level of less than significant. Now that's being imposed as mitigation. So there are a lot of ideas that I am going to show you at the end that you could use for mitigation that, with really good planning and discussions at the beginning of your project, could actually just be part of your project and make it a better project and not necessarily be imposed as mitigation. So another example of that might be relocation. And many jurisdictions require that if you have a demolition project as part of local ordinances, they'll often say, we're not just gonna approve this demo permit. We want to see what your replacement, is going to be as well. So part of the project, even if it's instead of demolition, it could be a relocation project, as opposed to relocation being imposed as mitigation for demolition. So setting the stage. I mentioned that mitigation shouldn't just be thought about on a project-by-project basis or at the end of a project, but there are a lot of things that local jurisdictions can do to preempt the need for mitigation or to provide guidance for developers, property owners, and jurisdictions on just good planning practices. And so there's a number of ways that, and within CEQA, that mitigation measures can be incorporated into a plan, policy, or regulation for the design. I see this often in specific plan EIRs, which are more general documents as opposed to at the individual project level. So the specific plan EIR might specify within that area, particularly if there is a historic district or historic buildings, that in the future, if there are going to be development projects, they might have to comply with certain design guidelines, or they might have to design projects in accordance with the Secretary of Interior standards and so forth. So that is not at all uncommon. I'm going to go through these very quickly because each one of these are really a topic in and of their own. Maybe, John, they're good ideas for future training sessions. But you could develop policies that mandate historic preservation. That could be either through the general plan, through goals and policies, or it could be through an ordinance. So you could have a preservation plan element. That's actually an optional element in the state of California. So not all jurisdictions have a historic preservation element within their general plans. You could expand policy guidance in the community plan areas, particularly if those particular community areas have a concentration of historic properties, to help protect the character of that neighborhood. You could set up a historic resources board or commission whose responsibility might be to review proposed alterations specifically to historic properties. It could be part of an existing body, such as a planning commission, or it could be a separate body. You can update your municipal code with provisions for overlay zones. The City of Los Angeles have overlay zones, which in effect are similar to historic districts, but within those zones, they might have specific guidelines for development, design guidelines, and so forth. To know what you have in advance, instead of dealing with it on a project-by-project basis, you could conduct surveys, and that might help inform the public in advance at the due diligence process so that developers aren't purchasing properties that they think are an excellent tear down and rebuild opportunity, but instead have the policy in place so that they know in advance what they're dealing with. That might lead to measures being part of a project like the Secretary of Interior standards as opposed to mitigation. You can align zoning densities to minimize development pressure. In some communities, if you have R4 zoned areas, for example, but the area has a collection of single family residences, 1,200 square foot bungalows. We did a project actually many years ago in the city of Glendale, where we only looked at their craftsman buildings because of this issue specifically. The single family craftsmen were located in R4 zoned areas, and they were finding that they were losing a lot of their single family residences to very large apartment buildings that was changing the character of the area. So by downzoning those areas, they could then alleviate that development pressure. You could identify receiver sites for density transfers. There are programs such as the transfer of development rights. I know in the city of San Francisco, this is something that they have. Transfer of development right, or a TDR, is actually where a historic property gives their air rights away or sells their air rights to an adjoining building, so that allowing the adjoining building to develop up into the sky to preserve that property. Again, alleviating the pressure, the development pressures that somebody might look at a historic building for its highest and best use. And the highest and best use for a property, particularly in an urban area, is not always in alignment with historic preservation values and practices. So if you're a savvy jurisdiction, you might have a menu of all of these options available. Obviously, a lot of these things require planning documents and time and money. But if you have a collection of historic properties within your community and it's important to the character of your community, you might consider implementing some of these measures in advance to provide carrots for developers when they're looking at purchasing or redeveloping properties within your community. So let's wrap it all up and bring it together here. You need to first define if you have a significant impact under CEQA. That's not the discussion of my topic. You've heard a lot about that already today. But first consider what the project objectives are. And again, that is usually defined in the purpose and need of a project. And the purpose and need of many projects does not necessarily include the language preserving historic properties. So if you're an advocate or if you're a member of the community, keep that in mind, and take the time to understand what the purpose of the project is. Sometimes a project from the local level in particular might be for the embetterment of the community as a whole. And the result of that might mean that a project might go through the process and the decision makers will make statements of overriding considerations, even though a project will have a significant impact on a historic property, because the nature of the project in their eyes feel the importance outweighs preserving specific historic properties. However, mitigation is here to lessen that impact, as we mentioned in the definition of mitigation. But it also should be a discussion early on. So if there's a scoping meeting that's discussing the project, it's important to get involved and be vocal and talk about the fact that there are historic resources present within a particular project area. Again, it could be a specific plan, it could be a redevelopment area or something, and let the decision maker know that that's an important value to you as one of your, as the community. And then also consider other uses for those historic buildings. And that should be part of the discussion, that not all buildings necessarily have a use as they were initially designed. And sometimes it's possible that those buildings could be adaptively reused for a new purpose. But no building can survive if it doesn't have a use. And just because we can't find a perfect use for that building doesn't mean that the building's at the end of its useful life. So to provide a new use that would allow that building to sustain into the future, sometimes it requires change, sometimes it requires relocation, and sometimes those changes might be more than what some of us as purist preservationists might want to see. Does that mean it's a bad project or that we're not good preservationists? Not necessarily. So keep that in mind too when you're doing your project planning, that just because something's not a pure preservation project with a capital P, that it isn't a good project, because the worst thing for a historic building is for it to sit vacant and unused. It will deteriorate faster over time and be subject to things like vandalism and so forth that actually will deteriorate the building faster. So sometimes we have to see the forest through the trees and not just look at an individual project and that individual project's impacts just because we don't like the outcome of a project, but we have to see the bigger picture in light of the project, overall project objectives and other uses for that particular building. So in considering mitigation for significant impacts, there's an old friend once told me, there's many alternatives. It's not just tear down or no tear down, it's over, under, through, or around. So in thinking about that, how can you avoid impacts on historic resource? You can either avoid them altogether, and you can do that through the no project alternative. You can change the design to physically move that roadway so it goes around a building. That's an avoidance alternative. If you can't avoid it, because maybe by avoiding it isn't going to achieve the project objectives. And again, keep in mind that the purpose and need of a project is not always preserving historic property. So if a lead agency determines that they have to lose a historic property in light of the entire project, that sometimes it is not feasible to avoid impacts on historic properties. You can minimize them. So there are a lot of mitigation measures that wouldn't necessarily avoid the impacts entirely, but they would lessen the impact on that project, or I'm sorry, on that building or resource. Or you can mitigate those as well. And sometimes people use the word minimize and mitigate interchangeably. I use them slightly differently, and there might be even professionals that disagree with me. But to me, I see minimizing as maintaining the resource and lessening impacts on it. And I see mitigation often as compensatory or giving something back to the community after something has been lost. That's not to say that it gives us a green light to destroy or demolish historic properties, because at the end of the day, we can just mitigate and all will be well. Because once a resource is lost, right? But that's not to say just because something is lost that we can't still tell the story of that building or give something back to the community to remunerate that loss that has occurred. So I wanted to touch on feasibility analyses, because under CEQA, there has been case law regarding what feasible actually means. And there's been some specific case law in regard to like Woodside versus, or the Friends of Woodside versus the City of Woodside regarding Steve Jobs' house, because they said it wasn't feasible for him to adaptively reuse his mansion, and instead he had to scrape it and build what he wanted in his mansion. I don't think anybody in America would think that that Steve Jobs couldn't afford to do something really fabulous with his building. And as a result of that case law, we started having discussions of financial feasibility as part of that. Because yes, in theory, anything can be done. You can, lift a building and put railroad tracks under it. You can, we could move that building to the moon if we needed to. But, economics is a part of that, and market analysis. So just because you can physically lift a building and move it somewhere else, what's going to happen to that building after it's moved? Is there a market for that building? If you have a concrete gymnasium and you feel that a feasible alternative would be to relocate that, that's great, but it's not feasible if you're going to plunk it down in the middle of a field somewhere and it's going to sit there another 30 years because there's not an alternate use for that building. So the discussion of feasibility does come into play, and it is influenced by economics and market conditions. It's also enforceability comes into play. If you relocate that building, where's it going to go? Is it going to go on somebody else's land? And does that person now become responsible for taking care of that and that resource? And if it comes out of the control of the lead agency, then what happens to the building? Under Section 106, that's actually handled under the adverse effect criteria. One of the adverse effect criteria under Section 106 is transfer or sale out of federal control. So if a federal lead agency wants to dispose of their property, for example, a post office or something, they have to transfer that often with a covenant or some kind of legally enforcing document that will require the continued preservation of that resource in place. And that responsibility transfers onto the new owner. The same thing happens if a building has an easement on the outside. An easement program is where property owners of historic buildings can receive tax deductions by donating their facades to the public. It's something similar to the transfer of development rights, where you're basically preserving the shell of that building and receiving some kind of financial gain from that. But that gain is from the person that gave the donation. But when they sell the property as part of the real property package, that has to stay with the deed, and so the new owner then takes on that responsibility. So going back to the enforceability and legally binding documents. So if you are requiring an easement as a mitigation measure, that has to be recorded with the county, and it has to be on the deed so that carries in perpetuity with that next property owner. And then Also, timing comes into play about when the mitigation measures will occur. Does it occur before a building is demolished, relocated, or altered? Does it happen after? How long does the lead agency have until that mitigation has to be completed? All of these things are part of the feasibility analysis. Is it physically possible to complete some of these mitigation measures before the planned project is going to occur? And then, is it legal? And that's where some of this case law comes into play and provides us professionals with more insight so that we can learn from those into the future as to whether or not a jurisdiction actually has the authority to impose particular measures on a property owner or not. I mentioned statement overriding considerations a couple of times. So this is probably one of the, this is where the lead agency decides that other factors than the project goals are more important than historic preservation. And again, it is discretionary. So just because you have a historic property and you've come up with the perfect adaptive reuse project, which might be, you're a developer and you have a historic theater and you want to put housing, public housing or low-income housing on that site. And you come up with a great adaptive reuse solution to rehabilitate that back into a theater. Well, that housing person is not in the business of theater management. So, you know, you have to take into consideration the discretion that the city cannot tell a private property owner that you must now stop the housing business and go into theater management. You must rehabilitate this building into a theater. They don't really have discretion to do that. But they could say, okay, we see that you want to put public housing here. Can you incorporate the theater into your public housing project, or can you adaptively reuse it? And that is one of the alternatives that they could or should evaluate as part of the analysis, not necessarily the one that will be selected. Perfect. Yeah, I'm right on schedule then. Okay, so how to write feasible and defensible mitigation measures. Again, this is one of the reasons I got into mitigation and I started teaching mitigation was because of my frustrations with either the fact that we go through the whole process and things would be impacted or demolished or relocated, and then it just sort of went somewhere and there was no means to track it or enforce it. And so oftentimes mitigation measures went undone. My other frustration was the fact that I was asked to actually conduct the mitigation on a project where I wasn't involved during the project planning process, and the mitigation measures were so vague that I didn't know if it was appropriate to charge my client $5,000 or $50,000. So there were no parameters there. And you can imagine as a lead agency how frustrating that is when you send it out to bid to 6 different consulting parties and you have ranges in price from $5,000 to $50,000. What are you going to get? How do you make a decision? Is the $5,000 bid enough? Are you going to get a good product? You don't know because the mitigation measures were not well defined. So neither Section 106 nor CEQA mandates a particular outcome in a project. They're both process-driven policy and laws, so they're really intended to identify impacts and disclose them to the public and decision makers. Neither one of them require retention of historic properties, even if the property is listed on the National Register. A building that's listed on the National Register, in theory, could be demolished at the ministerial level if a jurisdiction doesn't have policy in place to protect that. So there's absolutely nothing that the city planners or the public can do in that instance, even if a building is listed on the National Register. So that's something to, it really just requires considering alternatives, and at least one of those alternatives should consider a reuse of a historic building if it's feasible. Again, if it's feasible. Mitigation is the final step. We shouldn't start thinking about all the creative and fun things we're going to do after we destroy a building. It's not carte blanche. It's, mitigation isn't there to give, project planners carte blanche to just tear down the building or destroy it because then it'll no longer be eligible. So 10 years down the road, they can demolish it because it's no longer a resource. So there is a sliding scale, And it's important to tailor your mitigation with the project and tailor it with the actual building. If you have an unavoidable loss, if there is going to be a demolition, you must mitigate that. There's even a clause within CEQA that says documentation will not mitigate the loss of a historic resource. Back in the early 80s, right after CEQA had been started, people thought, well, we'll just take pictures of it and then we'll demolish it because the pictures will be our mitigation and it'll lessen impacts and then we're done. Well, no, you can't mitigate the loss of a historic property. You can compensate and you can commemorate, but you cannot lessen those impacts unless you do some of our avoidance alternatives that I'm going to talk about. Good mitigation directly addresses the loss of the resource, so there should be some kind of tie. An example of that would be if you have a public housing and you don't want the loss of other public housing, maybe you can, write information about that resource to provide information to the public so other people can then use it to evaluate properties. You want it to be, the mitigation should be for that building and not for something else. So you can't require somebody to fix something else up instead of fixing up that building. An analogy to that would be like a receiver site for something like biology. Sometimes it's like, okay, well, if you have X number of impacts on the trees here, then you can build a bunch of trees over there. But with historic properties, it doesn't quite work as well that way. That's not to say there are other venues that will allow similar things like that I'll go into. I think the mitigation should be useful and it should be readily accessible. And this is a passion of mine. To me, just writing a report about another report, because keep in mind that the reports have been written. We already know why it's eligible and evaluated. So why are we writing another report as mitigation? Instead, it should be something that will be of value to the public, will be engaging to the public, something that people have access to. And another report just sitting on a shelf in a library somewhere, to me, is not meaningful mitigation. So I'm trying to think of things that will be useful to the public in general. Is the mitigation specific? What is the mitigation? Are there guidelines in place to help guide somebody to conduct that mitigation, such as the Historic American Building Survey? It's very specific, large format, black and white photos. Instead of just saying, take photos of the building, are they large format? How many photos? How many views? Where are the photos going after you take the photos? Which repositories? Who's responsible for doing it? That should be outlined in the measure. Is the lead agency responsible? Is the property owner responsible? Is the new property owner responsible? Who is to conduct it? And then who's going to monitor that? Is there going to be monitoring throughout the process of construction? And then is there reporting back? Is the person responsible to tell the lead agency once they've completed the mitigation? And if so, how are they doing that? And what's the time frame? How long do they have to complete that mitigation? Those basic questions need to be answered in every single measure, or they're really not legally defensible. They could say it could be done, and 20 years down the road, they can say, well, it didn't say when we had to do it. We just haven't gotten around to it yet, or we haven't found the funding for it yet. But we will do it, promise, trust us. So here's some examples of mitigation. I've also given you your handout. Generally, I see that there is a sliding scale. The first is avoidance, and that's just not impacting it altogether. You can avoid it in a number of ways by relocating it or not doing the project, as I mentioned before. But it goes all the way through, like, how can you lessen, to, okay, now that something's lost, now what can we do? So the first and most common is the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, and that's because it's actually specifically stated in the guidelines that this is one measure that may lessen impacts to a level of less than significant, but keep in mind that that language states may, doesn't say that it does, and it doesn't say that that's the only way to lessen impacts to a level of less than significant. So I've worked with some local agencies that think their only option is to apply the Secretary of the Interior standards. Not all projects can meet the standards due to the nature of what the project is and what the project goals are. So maybe you could do the standards and pair it with other mitigation measures. Or maybe the standards aren't appropriate and you can come up with some other measures that would equally lessen to a level of less than significant. So keep in mind that it's a may and not a shall, and that it's not the only, despite the fact that it is specifically stated in the guidelines as opposed to others. It shall be considered, oh, this was the second half to the first, sorry. So where the project will be conducted in a manner consistent with the standards, the project's impacts shall generally be considered mitigated to a level of significance, and thus not significant. So that is the most common method to getting to a level of less than significant if that is your goal for the project. An avoidance alternative would be to retain it in place and rehabilitate it according to the standards. So if you do want to move forward with your project and you're not adopting the no project alternative, you could apply the standards. Or sometimes it's appropriate to leave it in place, and if you don't have a current use for it, to mothball it appropriately for future use. And I have seen projects where a certain person has come through, person A comes through and they want to rehabilitate it, and the public doesn't like the project and the project doesn't get approved because maybe it's not the right project for that building, and it sits for another 15 or 20 years until another property owner comes along. Sometimes that's the best thing for that building, sometimes it's not, because keep in mind a building that's unused will deteriorate faster. So you could end up with a demolition by neglect effectively. But the National Park Service has guidelines in Preservation Brief 31. So at the minimum, if a building is not going to be reused, or if it is relocated and retained for a period of time, you really should indicate how long it will be unused, and then you should really try to prepare it in accordance with this preservation brief to minimize harm to the building. And it's called mothballing. So it's closing it up to avoid vandalism and having mechanized systems in there to make sure that the temperature levels and things are minimized. I won't go into great detail, but it's to try to prolong that building's life despite its lack of use. You could relocate it on site if you have a large site. You could relocate it and do your project plan around it. You could relocate it off site to a completely different location as long as you have a new person that wants it and it has a new use in the new site. You could offer it for sale. You might not want that building, but there might be somebody else in the community who does. And you're so desperate to get rid of it that you'll sell it for $1, which is far less expensive than demolishing it anyway. Again, if you're going to offer it for sale, you have to do it for a certain period of time that should be specified in the agreements. And the person taking it too should probably also have certain parameters to be able to be a good steward, and they should have a suitable location offsite for that. So it's not as simple as just putting an ad in the paper for 20 days saying, building for sale, $1, come and get it. It's a little, you have to have more specific language. And then also too, if you've gone through that process and did your due diligence and nobody wants it, that's the if and then. So where you might have different alternatives. Try to sell it, and if nobody takes it, then you can go to the next step and do this instead. So you can do required design guidelines for compatible infill. So if you have a district situation, mitigation might be any new, the building that replaces it should be compatible with the existing surrounding. You can partially retain a building. Maybe you have a big factory or partially retain parts on a site, especially for large properties like a mill or something where there's not a use for the planing mill anymore, but there's a use for the crane shed. So partially keeping properties, adding on to them. You could retain the historic building and maybe do something not according to the Secretary of Interior standards. Some might say this meets the standards. I think there's probably an argument that would, but there are times where just retaining a building in place is still good preservation, even though we're not making a house museum out of it. And, again, that is a case by case and determined by the decision makers. You can retain a portion of the building, and this is an example of the Press Telegram building in Long Beach and the adjacent Meeker Baker building that they kept the first 10 feet of the building. Now, there are many critics, I'm sure, not only in the room and on the screen, that we call this the postage stamp approach to preservation. Some people may frown upon it, but there are other times where the alternative is total demolition, and maybe it can still maintain some semblance of a historic nature or that pedestrian value. This is what the historic building looked like historically. That's the addition to the back of it. Is this a good example? You decide. You can salvage pieces and parts of a building. So if something's not reused, I worked on the historic 6th Street Viaduct in downtown Los Angeles, and one of the mitigation measures was for them to retain a portion of one of the iconic arches on the bridge, as well as the lampposts, and they have a separate park project that's going in underneath the bridge, so they're reusing some of those elements of the bridge as part of the new project, with interpretation so that people understand where those salvaged pieces came from. But they're perfectly good. There are a lot of salvage yards that take architectural features, a lot of people that like them. Habitat for Humanity Restore is an example too. So if you're gonna lose something, you might as well reuse it. It's not only good for preservation, it's good for the environment. You can salvage and reuse portions of materials for the new development on site. So I have seen some projects require an art element. So maybe they'll take historic bricks and incorporate it into an art installation or something on the site. Again, with interpretation, you can still maintain the history of that site without, by using some of the pieces. You can donate or sell and use architectural features to salvage yards. You can document them. And again, this is now we're getting to a point, you can document and keep it and alter it, or you can document it if it's going to be lost. But documentation in and of itself will not minimize impacts to a level of less than significant. We have a Historic American Building Survey, HABS for short, that you can do even if there's not federal involvement. Most projects that involve HABs will go to the Library of Congress through the National Park Service because that's the program. But a lot of local governments use it too, and even state agencies, because it's a really good standardized format for documenting things, and it's archival. So maybe it won't go to the Library of Congress and we have like HABs-like photography that might just stay at a local library or local repository. Sometimes, depending on the significance of the property, if it's architecturally significant or there's information value there, we might require architectural drawings of that building, or we might require documentation or duplication of the original architectural drawings if they still exist. That also comes with a written narrative. Sometimes this would be more in-depth than the initial evaluation report, or it might go into more detail about a specific theme that wasn't necessarily addressed in the original. Aerial photography is also something that you can do, particularly for large properties. I was just recently in the Michigan area, and there were a lot of closed plants, auto plants and things, and you can't always document those very well from the ground. So sometimes aerial photography is a really good alternative to capture the relationship of multiple buildings to one another. College campus. I think later we're going to talk about Orange Coast College, and we actually did aerial photography as part of our HABS package, HABS-like package for Orange Coast College. So in some circumstances, documentation, this is what I mentioned, will not mitigate to a level of less than significant so that there's no longer an impact, but it's still a good idea to document it. So I wouldn't throw it out the window because it won't lessen to a level of less than significant, but it's definitely useful. Interpretation is a really great way it can be street signage, it can be kiosks. The bottom left one is more of an interpretive display about bridges along the LA River. On the right, it was a bridge that was completely replaced. So there's a plaque, the bronze plaque on the bridge. But in the future, people can go across and learn a little bit about the history of the building. So even though or the bridge or building, and even though it's gone, you can use portions and parts, like I mentioned earlier. This, I think, is in the Bay Area of an old shipyard, and they used old ship pieces to make art installation, and it's also interpretation. So it's not only art, but it provides history of the resource. This is an interesting example. This is in Philadelphia. That was Ben Franklin's old house. So it's a very loose interpretation of what the house probably looked like based on archaeology. And when you look at the base of it, you can see the archaeological footings of the building. Museums, if there's artifacts or things associated with the property, brochures, walking tours, these are all good ways, again, to show the history, puzzles, postcards, documentary films. I mean, that's pretty much the way people learn these days. So there's a real movement going toward both short film. This is one that we did for Southern California Edison up in the Eastern Sierra Nevada for a historic tram. We've done feature-length documentaries as well. This one, again, on the bridges of the city of Los Angeles. But the impacts on the 6th Street Viaduct was so great and so large that the mitigation measures, there were a lot more mitigation measures required at a much higher expense than a smaller project such as the tram. Other multimedia things, websites, electronic books or pamphlets, interactive things for children, coloring books for children that can help tell the history of something. Oral histories, especially if they're resources that are going to be lost and we want to capture the stories of that resource. We're actually currently working in Villa Park in Orange County here, and we're going to be conducting oral histories on a historic school that is listed on the National Register that will be demolished. It's after 10 plus years of CEQA trying to find, mitigations to relocate and reuse the building, and to no avail. The buildings will be demolished, but we are going to be talking to people that once worked in, lived in, and learned from those buildings. One thing that I see a lot is commemoration on features like, Philadelphia is really great about these signs. Even if a building is not there anymore, I'm kind of a history nerd, so I love to travel and learn about the history. Park benches, it could be on trash receptacles, it could be anything. Nashville, I was recently in, and in their parks, they had a lot of history carved into stones just along pathways. So there's a lot of opportunities to give back. Murals, public art, showing what it used to look like. All of these things have educational value, even though properties might be lost. And this is the all forever topic of, can somebody pay money in lieu of doing other mitigation measures? And there are a few jurisdictions that have done this, some successfully, some I think they're still assessing. The city of Long Beach had a case, and it involved, it was a federal agency in the port area, and so they have the Navy Trust that now has a pot of money that was used because of mitigation, but now they use that pot of money to give grants for historic preservation every year. So that's an example of where you can establish a fund, and people can pay into it, and down the road that fund can be used for other preservation projects. Again, legally defensible documents, it needs to have parameters on how it's used. So checklist, just to wrap it up, to have good mitigation, is the significance defined? Is there a nexus between your project and mitigation? Do your measures, are they feasible? Does everybody agree what's going to be done, and who and how? What are the parameters? And is it something that's going to be good for the general public? Who's accountable? And are there any additional impacts? All of your measures I've put in your handout, so I encourage you to look at that. And that's it. So go on, be happy, mitigate. Thank you. Sure. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that part. Are there any questions? Hungry. I was so thorough, I just baffled you. Okay.